Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis. Now, this was published in 1955, and it was originally written in Greek, but the English translation of this novel, which is obviously what I read, was published in 1960. Now, Nikos Kazantzakis, if I'm even saying his name right, is also the author of books like The Odyssey, a modern sequel, Christ Recrucified, and Zorba the Greek. Zorba the Greek might actually be his most famous book next to this one. Now, Kazantzakis was a very controversial figure in his lifetime, and this was a very controversial book. Now, he was Greek Orthodox, and several members of the Greek Orthodox Church actually tried to have him excommunicated because of this book and because of his writing in general, and some members of the church actually tried to have this book banned in Greece. Like, they actually considered the book to be blasphemous. Now, I know Kazantzakis also embraced Buddhism in his life, which very much conflicted with his Christian beliefs, and I think you very much see that spiritual conflict come out in this story. Now, being that Jesus is the main character of this novel, it's going to be very hard to talk about this book and not also talk about religion, and I might even go into what my own personal beliefs are. I'm going to say right up front that I do believe in God, but I personally believe religion in general, and this goes for all religions, be it Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, is really just man's way of trying to understand God. So I guess you could say I'm kind of a deist, where I believe there's a God, but I don't necessarily believe it's the Christian God. And I'm not trying to offend anybody who is a Christian or is of any specific faith. That's just my personal philosophy. I do read the Bible from time to time, not so much for spiritual guidance, but more so on a historical level, and I don't mean that as in, I think all the stories in the Bible are historically accurate. I mean more so in the sense that, whether you believe in God or not, or whether you like it or not, the Bible as a book has probably had a bigger impact on Western civilization than any other text. So purely on that level, I think it's a fascinating book. I also think it's interesting how much is actually not in the Bible that's still sort of been accepted by Christians over the years. But enough with my half-baked theological discussion, now onto my actual thoughts on this novel. Now, as somebody who, as I said, I believe in a higher power, but I don't necessarily identify myself as a Christian, or at least not a full-fledged Christian, I still found this to be a deeply spiritual novel and a profoundly moving human drama. Now, I think regardless of what your faith or lack thereof might be, I think you could still enjoy this book just as a novel. I mean, I know quite a few atheists who really like this book. At the same time, though, I will say, if you are a hardcore Christian, I'm not gonna lie, there is some stuff in this book that you might find problematic. But I personally can separate what my own personal beliefs are from the fiction that I read. And I think just as a book, it's a fascinating portrait of who Jesus could have been, and regardless of whether or not you actually believe Jesus was the Son of God, or whether or not you even believe he was a real person, because I know some historians debate that, regardless, we all know the name Jesus Christ, and I think this book is a really interesting look at who this guy could have been. I will also be giving away some plot spoilers in this review, just because I feel like it's kind of necessary to really explain some of the themes of this novel. Now, the plot of The Last Temptation is it's a retelling of the life of Jesus, but it portrays Jesus more as a man rather than a divine creature. Now, he's still the Son of God in this novel, and he still performs miracles in this book, but what Kazantzakis is kind of going for here is, if Jesus really was both man and God at the same time, how would that have affected a person psychologically and spiritually and even morally? And you get this real conflict between the part of Jesus that is God and the part of Jesus that is man, and that conflict really is the heart of this story. So, in the beginning of this novel, Jesus is a man plagued by visions and voices, and God comes to him essentially in the form of an invisible eagle digging its talons into Jesus' head. So, in the beginning of this story, Jesus is doing essentially anything he can to get God to hate him, to get God to just leave him alone. He's even building crosses for the Romans to crucify people on, which very much makes him sort of a pariah because he's basically a collaborator with the oppressors of his people. So Jesus, he goes on this spiritual journey to try to figure out what God wants of him, and eventually he realizes that he is the Messiah. He is the one who will liberate his people from the Romans and will also save the souls of mankind. Now, I want to say up until the last maybe 60 or 70 pages of this book, it does follow the basic story of the Gospels. But then, as Christ is being crucified, the devil shows him a vision, or sort of a glimpse into an alternate reality where he never had to die on the cross, and he was able to live out a long and happy life, and get married and have children. And you realize that that's the devil's ultimate temptation. Not, I'm gonna give you all the kingdoms of the world in all their glory. It's, I'm gonna give you a long and happy life. The devil's final temptation is not, I'm gonna make you a god, it's, I'm gonna make you a man. But then you also see the consequences of Jesus living this normal life. This book also has some really interesting and thought-provoking ideas, one of which is, was the idea of Jesus more important than the man himself? Like, there's a scene in the Last Temptation sequence of this book when Jesus is living this normal life where Paul, formerly known as Saul, comes to Jesus' home and is preaching that Christ died on the cross and 3 days later was resurrected, and Jesus is like, what are you talking about? That never happened. I'm right here. And then Paul outright says to him, I don't care. It's the story that counts, and the fact that people will believe the story that counts. And he basically says to him, it doesn't matter if it's true or not, it will be true to people who believe it. And even before the whole Last Temptation sequence, there's a part of this book where Matthew is starting to write the Gospels. He's starting to document the life of Christ, and as he's doing this, at first he's trying to be as factually accurate as possible, but then an angel comes to him and is like, no, write it this way. And then when Jesus starts reading the Gospel according to Matthew, he's pissed at first. He's like, what is this? This isn't how it actually happened. And it's this whole idea that God's truth is different than man's truth, and it doesn't matter if it happened or not. The fact is, it will become the truth to people who believe it. And that's an aspect of this novel that I could see people who really do believe in the Bible having an issue with, because it's basically saying, yeah, not everything in the Gospels is 100% true. I also thought the characterization of Judas Iscariot, the biblical betrayer of Christ, I thought it was really interesting in this novel because he's actually portrayed very sympathetically. Like, in the beginning of the novel, he's a zealot, he's part of this group of Israelites who want to violently overthrow the Romans, and in the beginning of the story, he's actually sent to kill Jesus, but then when he sees Jesus might be on the path to God, he decides to give Jesus a second chance, and as the novel goes on, he becomes probably Jesus' most devoted disciple. And the only reason Judas betrays Jesus is because Jesus asks him to. Like, the book really does play with this idea that Jesus absolutely had to die on the cross. Had he not been crucified, had he not become a martyr, he would have just been another prophet. Now, the book's characterization representation of Mary Magdalene is interesting, but could definitely be problematic for some people. In the book, she's portrayed as a repentant prostitute, and I know Kazantzakis was not the first person to interpret her as that. And this does sort of reinterpret that story from the Bible of the woman who committed adultery, who's about to be stoned to death, and then Jesus says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," and everybody backs down. This sort of reinterprets it where it's Mary Magdalene who's about to be stoned to death, basically for being a prostitute. And I don't even think Kazantzakis is the first person to interpret that woman from that particular story from the Bible as being Mary Magdalene. Now, an issue you could have with the characterization of Magdalene in this story is you kind of get this idea that the whole reason she became a prostitute is because in their past, there was a point where her and Jesus were going to be together, but he rejected her, and that's kind of why she became a prostitute. And then even when she repents and goes with Jesus, I kind of got this sense that she's kind of just with him because she wants to be with him, not so much because she wants to be with God and genuinely be forgiven for her sins. And I will say the treatment of women in this novel is problematic, to say the least. Basically, every female character in this novel is more or less completely submissive to the male characters. Of course, there are a few factors that you have to keep in mind with that. One is the fact that this has taken place 2,000 years in the past, and not for nothing, while I don't agree with it at all, back then, women weren't treated very well, and women were viewed as property back then. And I think it's wrong, but not for nothing, history isn't politically correct. And on top of that, this story is being written by a man who was already an old man by the second half of the 20th century, and during Kazantzakis' time, while I don't think it's right, women weren't viewed as equals. So, while the characterization of women in this novel is less than flattering, it's not surprising given the time period it was published in and the time period it's taken place in. Another thing people might have an issue with in this novel is the characterization of Mary, Jesus' mother. And she wants Jesus to live a normal life and give her grandchildren, and when she tries to speak to him after he goes on this path, he doesn't recognize her at all, or at least acts like he doesn't recognize her. And I know how Jesus' mother was portrayed in this story was very controversial for a lot of people. Another thing I thought was really interesting was how this book handles the whole Lazarus story, where after Jesus brings Lazarus back, he's kind of fucked up, actually. Like, it describes it where he's still kind of rotten, like, his body isn't exactly right, like, he's basically a zombie. There's also a point in this story where somebody is sent to kill Lazarus because Lazarus is the proof of Jesus' miracles, and I don't want to give too much away about the scene where this guy goes to kill Lazarus, but it's actually a really creepy scene. Like, it's like something out of a horror novel. I also thought it was interesting how in the Last Temptation portion of this novel, when Jesus is living out this normal life, he's calling himself Lazarus. I also noticed a possible Dante influence on this novel, because I know Kazantzakis actually translated Dante into Greek, and he actually kind of compared himself to Dante during his life. And a lot of the times in this novel, when hell is referred to, it's referred to as the Inferno. Now granted, I'm not sure if Dante was the first person to refer to hell as the Inferno, but that kind of struck me as a Dante reference. But yeah, The Last Temptation of Christ I thought was an excellent novel, and was a very powerful story. And it's not exactly what I would call light reading, but not for nothing, not everything needs to be. And if you're a reader and you don't challenge yourself every so often, then why the hell do you even read? Now, this book was adapted into a film of the same name in 1988, which was directed by Martin Scorsese, and people might want to, no pun intended, crucify me for saying this, but I actually think the movie The Last Temptation of Christ is Martin Scorsese's masterpiece. And the movie was equally controversial. In fact, the movie might have even been more controversial than the book. In fact, Scorsese was originally going to make the movie in 1983, I think for Paramount, but there was a huge letter-writing campaign from people, most of whom probably never even read the book, and this actually halted the 1983 production. But fortunately, Scorsese was able to adapt the movie for Universal in 1988. In the movie, Willem Dafoe played Jesus, and he gave a really heartbreaking and emotionally moving performance. Barbara Hershey played Mary Magdalene, and she also gave a phenomenal performance in the film. In fact, Barbara Hershey is part of the reason the movie got made, because she actually gave Martin Scorsese a copy of the book in the early 70s. In the movie, Harvey Keitel played Judas, and a lot of people did not like his performance in that movie. In fact, he was actually nominated for a Razzie that year, and I don't see it as being a bad performance at all. I actually think he gave a pretty powerful performance as Judas. It was also kind of cool seeing David Bowie as Pontius Pilate. I also thought the movie's interpretation of the devil was pretty cool, where the devil took on the form of a little girl, which is actually not the form that the devil took on in the book. Actually, the whole thing of Satan being a little girl was actually Martin Scorsese's tribute to the Mario Bava film Kill Baby Kill, in which the devil took on the form of a little girl. And as I pointed out already, the movie was probably more controversial than the book. It had protests, which isn't really surprising because a lot of religious-based films like The Exorcist or Dogma or The Passion of the Christ have also had protesters. But people went way further than just protesting. In Paris, a theater that was showing the movie was actually set on fire by a Christian extremist group. Fortunately, I don't think anybody was killed, but people were severely injured. And there have been books written about the controversy surrounding the film. In fact, it would make a really interesting feature documentary. Now, I don't know if this comic was actually influenced by the book or not, and this comic came out before the movie, but 30 years after the book was published, but in 1985, Alan Moore did a Superman comic called For the Man Who Has Everything, which actually seemed very similar to this, only instead of Jesus, it used Superman. Again, I'm not sure if Alan Moore was actually taking inspiration from this book or not, but it wouldn't surprise me because Moore always incorporates literary allusions into his comics, and a lot of writers over the years have tried to incorporate Christ-like allegories with Superman. There was also a two-part X-Files episode called The Sixth Extinction, in which Mulder is captured by the Syndicate, who are the main villains of that show, and they put him in sort of a dream state where he essentially has a vision where he lives out a normal life where he's not fighting against the alien conspiracy. And you could tell that episode was very much taken off of The Last Temptation of Christ. Like in the episode, Mulder was essentially a representation of Jesus, and the cigarette-smoking man was a representation of Lucifer, and Scully ended up representing Judas. You could even see the influence of The Last Temptation of Christ in a movie like Donnie Darko. I think Donnie Darko is more so inspired by the movie Last Temptation rather than the book, but in the beginning of Donnie Darko, Donnie wakes up in a very similar way that Jesus wakes up in the beginning of Last Temptation of Christ. And there's also a scene in that movie where Donnie Darko takes his girlfriend to see The Evil Dead, and on the marquee is The Evil Dead and The Last Temptation of Christ. And this is a more ridiculous example of The Last Temptation's influence, but in the third Toxic Avenger movie, the Toxic Avenger fought Satan, and that movie was called The Last Temptation of Toxie, obviously taking its title from the title of this novel and the film adaptation of this novel. So yeah, that was my review on The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis, and bye.